Hey everyone, thanks for watching this video. I decided since I missed the lecture yesterday because of weather, it made sense so that we didn't fall behind so early in the semester to record something so that you could watch it. And then next week we can start on research methods. Um, when I was heading into to teach class yesterday, the roads were horrible. So by the time our class rolled around, I realized I might have been a little too conservative, but I hope everyone stayed safe and warm. And I'll look forward to seeing you in person on Tuesday. But today, what I'm going to run us through is different perspectives in psychology, because what we'll learn throughout the semester is that depending on what school of thought somebody comes from, they're going to have a very different take on what is the underlying motivation or driving factor behind different types of behavior. And so one person may look at somebody doing um, a particular behavior and think it's probably due to a brain imbalance or that type of thing, where someone else may look at that same behavior and think, oh no, this is because somebody has some unresolved trauma from childhood. And so it's really important for us to understand the different perspectives that we'll be revisiting a lot during the semester. So the first thing I want to start with is just a working definition of psychology for our course. And so psychology is defined as the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. So I don't know if you remember in the first class, but I talked about there being kind of a real decades long struggle for psychologists to feel like they were taken seriously. And part of what helped us get to this current definition is that psychologists really wanted to adhere to the scientific method to be taken seriously, but also through that process, they've been able to sort of reunite the behavior side and the mental processy side so that we don't have to pick one or the other. Before the invention of machines like the EKG or the CT scan or the MRI, a lot of what was happening in the brain was just a mystery to us. And now we know that we can actually put someone in an MRI machine and see what parts of their brain are being activated when they're doing certain behaviors. And so now we know that when we talk about psychology, we're definitely talking about the observable behavior that we see in ourselves and others, but we're also talking about those internal experiences, the thoughts, feelings, fantasies, dreams, fears, all of that stuff that, before the advent of those technologies, we really didn't understand a lot about how it was happening or where it was happening in the brain. And so the goals of psychology have become one, to describe behavior. And that's sort of where these theories are going to come in. So different theorists have different ways to describe different behavior that they're seeing and different ways to explain it. And then it's also used to predict future behavior. And so I think someone in class was talking about marketing. And so if I really understand what matters most to someone or motivates them, I will probably be much more effective in selling them something and predicting how they'll respond to that because I understand the psychological process that's happening. The other thing that can happen is that we can influence future behavior. So understanding that, all of these things help us bring some awareness and choice to the process so we can actually make different choices and solve our problems better and sort of become our best selves, maximize our potential. One of the key questions in psychology historically has been this debate between nature and nurture. And so this is another area where I think psychologists spend a lot of time trying to fight for their side and not really advocating for, the fact that it is both, that both of these things matter equally and importantly. So when we talk about nature, we're talking about genetics. So what is your genetic blueprint when you come into this world? What are your potentials? What are your capacities? What are your vulnerabilities? All of that stuff is written into our genes. And then the nurture side is the environment. So how are we treated as we're growing up? What is the environment like? Is it reassuring and comforting and encouraging and uplifting? Or is it one that, discourages self-expression or isn't encouraging, growth in some way? And so we really want to look at the interaction of both of these things. And so I have an example on the screen of intelligence. And so I'm going to sort of change it a little bit to musical intelligence. So let's imagine we have somebody who, if we were able to sort of peek inside and look at their genes, we would know that they have the genetic makeup to be a marvelous cello player, that they can do all of these things and, be really wonderful and a talented musician. So the genetic foundation is there. But what we have learned through our studies is that if the environment doesn't nurture what the genes are capable of, then we're going to get different outcomes. So, with that child who has this musical potential, if they are raised in a family where music is played a lot and the parents have music appreciation and the child is able to take cello lessons or other instruments, that child is likely to experience sort of an activation of that gene where they are able to fulfill this talent that they have and develop these skills. Whereas that same child, if we put them in a home or a circumstance where those those factors weren't encouraged, so no music in the house, no interest or ability to fund music education and those types of things, that same child with all of that genetic potential may experience what they call a turning off of gene expression because the environment wasn't what it needed to be in order to help that person thrive and sort of lean into that talent or skill that they innately have. So we know that positive experience can turn on gene expression. And we also know that negative or stressful experience can turn off gene expression. So one of the ways I sometimes think about it is like, imagine I have a very rare and beautiful flower bulb and I need to take care of it. I can put it on my counter and hope for the best and not give it anything it needs. Or I can make sure that I'm giving it the exact right soil with the exact right pH and water and sunlight and fertilizer. And maybe I'll sing and talk to it or whatever. But what we know is that the bulb that's put in the correct nurturing soil is going to grow and thrive. And the bulb that is put in sort of a deficient environment is not going to have that same ability to grow and thrive. And so I think that's kind of a key metaphor for us to hold for ourselves as humans, too, that when we think about meeting our potential or becoming all who we can be, environment or soil really matters. And so good soil for a human may be, encouragement or room to make mistakes or just a lot of love and encouragement and teaching someone how to deal with setbacks or failure. And a deficient environment may look like no emotional interaction or intelligence or guidance, very little resources given to help the person thrive and grow. And so we're going to constantly throughout the semester be thinking about like what are those ideal growing conditions for a human being. The other thing that's important to sort of understand as we move into the rest of the semester is that for a lot of people, when we talk to them about what we're learning in psychology, the response we often get is, duh, I could have told you that. Like that's everybody knows that. That's complete common sense. I can't believe you're wasting all this money on studies to prove something that I could have told you with my high school degree, or I could have told you without ever having taken a psych class. And so common sense obviously has real limits. So intuition, I'm a full believer that some of us have really strong senses of intuition, but that's not enough to sort of come up with a psychological theory. Psychological theories need to follow the scientific method to confirm or disconfirm what we think we know. And so we have to recognize common sense can be biased, it can be inaccurate. And so psychology really pushes us, and psychological theory pushes us to make sure that we're testing our ideas in these experimental situations that we can control. And then more importantly, that they're repeatable. So if I do a study and I come up with some conclusion, and I publish it, like that's all well and good. But the main thing I need to make sure is that any other psychologist who follows me and follows the exact same steps I took in my research should be able to come up with the exact same findings. And if they don't, that really speaks to a problem with the research method. And next week in class, we're really going to dive into the different types of research and how we understand what's true and what's not true and when to sort of, second guess what we're reading. So we'll cover that more, but to really understand that common sense is very limited. I wanted to give you a couple of examples of the science, just because, I think we all, myself included, have had these thoughts of, I can't believe you spent $3 million on that. But here we see an example of a Harvard sleep expert who spent $3 million studying doctors. And what he concluded was that doctors who don't get enough sleep make mistakes. I think any human being who's ever been underslept will tell you you're not functioning at your best. And so, a layperson or someone who hasn't taken a psych class may look at this and be like, what a waste of money. Like, we didn't need to study this. And the other example I came up with is kind of similar, but a study in 2005 found that pilots who drink and drive are at higher risk to crash planes. And so again, someone from the outside may be like, I can't believe that counts as like legit research. But in reality, it just kind of shows us that, you know, from the outside, a lot of things can look obvious, especially in hindsight. And we need to make sure that we're always returning to the steps of the scientific method to make sure that what we're saying is true and testable and repeatable and accurate. Here's a couple of examples of bad science that have existed in psychology recently. The first one is the vaccine autism study. So for decades, well, since 1998, so not fully 2 decades, there was this belief because of this study that was published in 1998 that there was a link between childhood vaccinations and the child later developing autism. And so for many people who heard this research, they allowed it to shape their decisions. So a lot of people chose to opt out of vaccinations for their child for fear that they would later become autistic, and made other sort of important health decisions based on these findings. And what happened later in I think it was 2012, the researcher actually had to come out and retract his findings because there were many problems with his study that he didn't reveal in the first unveiling. And one of them being sample size. So, sample size is the number of people that you're testing. And in this case, he only tested 12 children. And one of the things we'll talk about next week is that in order to have a really good study, you need to have a sizable, diverse sample size. You can't bring 12 children all from the same neighborhood in, watch them, test them, and then think that you have any information that you can generalize to children in other school districts or other neighborhoods or other situations or other cultures. The other thing we discovered about Dr. Wakefield, who did this study, was that he had some conflicts of interest because he was actually being funded and paid by lawyers who were suing vaccine manufacturers. So when they gave him that pile of money, there was a very clear expectation that the results that he found supported their lawsuit, supported what they wanted to pursue. And so, yes, he publicly took it back and said he was wrong, but in some ways the damage had been done, that a lot of people had heard this for a number of years through lots of different settings and chose to alter their behavior of it. And so now we're living in a world where we're still experiencing people who have a lot of vaccine fear or hesitancy, and we're seeing a resurgence of diseases that had previously been eradicated or prevented. Polio being probably one of the main ones that we're seeing in the news right now, is that because people have opted not to vaccinate their children, a disease that was essentially eradicated in the 1950s is now coming back. Another one is power posing research. So I don't know if anyone's ever heard of this, but there was a study that said that if you kind of stood like a superhero with your arms on your hips or your hands on your hips and kind of proudly standing up tall and straight, that this type of posture could actually translate to feelings of power and competence and strength. And so a lot of people started doing this. There were TED Talks about it. Like people were really trying to talk about and promote this idea of a power pose being a really great way to sort of, gain confidence, especially before a presentation or a job interview or a sporting event where you felt like you really had to kind of summon your energy and your potential to do the best out there. Later attempts to replicate that research didn't find, the same results. And so here we are with some research that isn't really validated and isn't really supported. But again, the risk is that there's this message out there that this is effective. And I would argue that, there's no harm in power posing, even if it just gives you a moment to think. But so the harm caused by power posing is very different than the harm caused by choosing not to vaccinate your child. And then the last one is recovered memories. So there were theories that some people could go through incidents and events that were so traumatic during their childhood that there were memories that kind of got pushed under the surface and they weren't able to access. So it was almost like a blackout or like large periods of their life that they weren't able to remember. And so a lot of psychologists who were working with different patients who may have had childhood trauma were finding that if through hypnosis or questioning that these folks in therapy could actually remember something or recover a memory that had happened to them. And so again, this is really where you need to pay attention because there was a huge lack of any scientific evidence behind this. It was a lot of anecdotal stories coming from therapists about their individual clients, but there wasn't any sort of systemic scientific review of this. And so again, when you think about, someone being in therapy to talk about childhood trauma or something like that, that this can be really tricky, especially if there's ever going to be any legal action taken or any other sort of official steps taken to um, address the trauma that someone is recovering and put them in that situation. So for one thing, for instance, we know like childhood eyewitnesses during court cases are very unreliable because a child's memory is very faulty. And this research sort of implied that someone could then recover and sort of have a fully formed memory. And now we're seeing that this is not really the case. I will say personally, I have mixed feelings about this. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the psych disorder section. But I think it's one of those trickier areas in psychology where we have to make sure that, what we're saying and what we're doing isn't discrediting the lived experience of a lot of people. So we'll talk about that. But for the most part, recovered memories in a legal proceeding are not going to be taken seriously because of sort of what we've discovered about how they're formed and how they're extracted from memory. Another thing I want to talk about is this thing called social determinants of health. And basically, what this means is that we now know that factors like financial and socioeconomic status, whether you have safe, secure housing, whether you have access to a good education, whether your neighborhood is safe, are you being the target of discrimination on a daily basis? Do you have access to healthcare? That we know a lot of these just environmental or sort of life situation factors have a huge impact on our physical and mental health. And so one of the things we know is that for marginalized groups who experience daily discrimination, either through like one-on-one interactions with people or through the sort of racist systems that are in place that exclude people, not just racism, but like a lot of ways that marginalized groups are excluded. We know that stress can actually lead to negative outcomes. So one of the more famous studies found that Black men have higher rates of coronary heart disease than white men and men of other sort of ethnic and racial groups. And at first glance, it was really easy for a lot of people, those sort of doing the science, to look at that and say, well, it's just because they live differently. They treat their bodies differently, or maybe they're not making healthy choices or this or that. And what we were able to do through science is to really identify that it had nothing to do with any of those other factors. It wasn't about lifestyle or habits or anything like that, but all of those sort of negative health outcomes, illnesses, diseases, vulnerabilities were directly caused by the stress of being discriminated against. The other thing that we know is that folks who are under resourced don't have the same access to healthcare or education that other groups do. And so this creates an uneven playing field. And finally, looking at folks' neighborhood effects. So, are you living in a safe environment? Is your home or apartment safe? Do you feel supported, or is there toxicity and trauma and abuse happening? And even if your home is safe, when you leave the house, is your neighborhood supportive of health and well-being, or are you encountering other factors or other barriers that are actually making it harder for you to be well in your living situation? So I talked in the first session just about really making sure that as we move through the semester, we are being as inclusive as possible. That for many, many years, the psychology field was dominated by theorists who were white male scholars. And that part of what came out of this is that we kind of got a narrower view of human behavior and mental health and all these other things because we were only testing it through one identity group. And so, what may be true for a 45-year-old white man may not necessarily be true for a woman or someone who's lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer identifying, or somebody who comes from a different, cultural or racial background. That we need to make sure that when we're talking about research, we also need to make sure that everybody is included because historically they haven't been, that the stories tend to center one identity over the others. And so my wish for us as we move forward is that we really continue to look for those diverse voices and experiences. And part of what I do in my class is make sure that when I'm assigning readings or showing videos in class or asking you to look up something, I want to make sure that I'm not only exposing you to one voice, that you're getting sort of a broad range of experiences so that when we make these assertions or talk about what we know about psychology, we know that it is as inclusive as possible. Here's an example that I just wanted to share just to kind of show you how, we do sometimes course correct over time. That up until 1973, homosexuality was considered a mental disorder. And so if you pulled out a copy of the DSM, which is the diagnostic manual that therapists use to make diagnoses of different mental disorders, up until 1973, you would have found homosexuality in there. And so anytime someone who was lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer went to their therapist, they were more likely to be treated as someone who was not normal and had a problem to be fixed rather than understanding that we're just dealing with a diversity issue or that that we're really missing something. And so the decision to take it out in 1973 really reflected a lot of learning that had taken place in our society and really understanding that some of the ways that we were taught to think about things like LGBT issues may have been influenced by other people's bias, and there might have been some stigma involved. And so we need, again, to make sure that we're constantly looking for that bias in the studies that we're reading to make sure that we're not perpetuating any misinformation or harm to other groups. So now I want to talk about the different perspectives in psychology. So the lenses at which different psychologists or theorists look at human behavior and then come up with ways to describe and explain it. And so the first one is biological. And so folks in this camp really focus mainly on how biological processes in the body affect our behavior, our mental state, all of those types of things. And so for these people, they're really going to be interested in, yes, your genetics, like what does your genetic blueprint say, but also looking at your neurotransmitters, those chemicals in the brain that sort of help us function and regulate mood and all those pleasure, all those other things. Is there something happening there? Or is there something happening hormonally that may describe the behavior that we're seeing? And so what they do is really investigate the biological changes that might affect these things. And so, adolescence is a perfect example that we all know that it's very common for adolescents to get a little irritable and kind of stubborn and those types of things. And all of those behaviors that we see as being typically teenager or adolescents, most of them are driven by hormones because there's a lot going on hormonally that we can't see with our eye, but we know is happening under the surface. The next camp is the developmentalists. And so these are the folks who are really going to take a look at how people grow and change throughout their whole lives. And so starting with infancy, taking a look at what are the capabilities and capacities of this human being at this phase of life. So what are they able to do cognitively? What are they able to do emotionally in terms of bond formation or, making connection? What are they able to do socially in terms of kind of understanding their place in the world and thinking sort of beyond themselves? And then what's happening physically? How are their bodies changing? Not too long ago, it used to be that a lot of people just believed that children were short adults, but that they had the same capacities and abilities. And now we know that's not true, that we know that when a 5-year old is approaching a problem, they're going to use very different tools and strategies and theories to solve that problem than someone who's 25 would. So the 25-year-old is going to be able to approach a problem with a higher level of critical thinking and self-awareness. They're going to be able to tolerate ambiguity and think hypothetically, whereas a younger child, their brain is simply not capable of that. And so for a young child, it's kind of what you see is what you get. They're very concrete. They can't hypothesize. They can't sort of do that type of thing that is often required to solve problems in our lives. The next group is the cognitive folks. And so these are the folks who really take a look at how our mental processes kind of mimic how computers work. So how is memory formed? How do we make decisions? How do we perceive different things? And so just like if you were sitting down to write a paper, there's going to come a point in that where you have to save your paper so you don't lose it in the future. And so you have to then decide, where am I going to save it? Is it going to be on the desktop so it's easy to find? Am I going to bury it in a folder that I never check? What am I going to name it? Because what we choose to name our files is going to be a lot more helpful in helping us sort of retrieve them when necessary, rather than sort of looking at, and I'm as guilty of this as other people. Like if you go into my Google folder, I'll have like 20 documents called untitled document, and I have to sift through them all to figure out what I was looking for. And so these folks really look at how our brains kind of work mechanically or as machines, and how these processes are formed. But they're really looking at how thinking abilities change over time as the brain grows and develops. The psychodynamic folks. So this is where you're going to encounter Sigmund Freud. And he was one of the first people to come up with this theory. He was the first psychoanalyst and one of the first psychodynamic thinkers, where he really understood or thought that a lot of the struggles that we have in our life are due to unconscious motivations and drives or early childhood experiences that we, pushed under the rug somehow. But basically coming back to this idea that any sort of conflict or struggle that we have can originate from these earlier experiences in life. And so, for instance, Freud may say that somebody who is a smoker or who chews their nails or is a overeater or things like that, that Freud would say maybe they got stuck in that early infantile stage where it was very normal and developmentally appropriate to get your comfort through your mouth. So infants suck pacifiers and their thumbs and their hands and anything else they can get their hands on for safety, comfort, and pleasure. And so Freud would say that if you're still engaged in those type of behaviors as an adult, maybe you're stuck back there. We'll have a lot of time to unpack and be critical of some of his theories later, but this is sort of what folks in his camp are thinking about. Then you have the humanistic folks. So these kind of the touchy-feely people, but their main belief is that every person is inherently good and every person has potential and can thrive if the situation is right. And so their main belief is that if you go back to that soil analogy, that they believe that the best soil is created when there's empathy and self-awareness and compassion and non-judgment. And so understanding that for a lot of us, it's the shame or, the negative stories that we've been told about who we are, how we are, that get in our way of sort of becoming the person that we want to be and sort of fulfilling our personal goals. And so someone from this theoretical perspective is largely going to focus on how can I create a situation where someone feels really loved no matter what they tell me, even if they tell me their deepest, darkest secret, that I'm going to accept them and I'm not going to judge them and that there's space for them to talk about that sort of thing. The behaviorists, these are the folks who are still looking at observable behaviors. So how do we learn different types of things? How do we grow and change over time? And their main focus is that a lot of the things that we do in our lives, behaviors that we do, were reinforced at some point in our earlier development. And so, a simple example, if I am someone who has, I'm a recycler and I make sure that I really think about my environmental impact, that a behavior should say that at some point during my growing up years, that those concerns and those interests were actually rewarded by caregivers. So I got a lot of attention, or maybe there were other rewards that I got for acting and behaving in this way. Conversely, how does punishment, like if we get negative results from what we're trying to do, how does that shape behavior if I'm trying to do something and I'm met with negative consequences? So behaviorists are largely about what is the consequence that follows an action, and how does that consequence, whether it's positive or negative, shape sort of how a person behaves after that. The sociocultural folks, these are the ones who look at culture and the world around us and really making sure that you don't try to see someone in isolation. I can't have someone come into my office and just sort of look at them as an individual without their cultural history or their family traditions, or sort of what they grew up thinking is right and wrong. So you have to really understand that the influences that they've been experiencing, so family beliefs, values, their friends and what they believe and what they think, what they're learning at school, what they're learning through the church or temple or religion, those types of things, and the media, all of these really shape how we think and act, because we're sort of thinking about culture as like the water we swim in, that there's a lot of stuff that we just sort of take in through osmosis that we're not normally thinking about, that are influenced by these factors that shape our behavior. The trait theorists believe that we all come into this world with sort of a handful of personality traits. And for the most part, that these traits are stable. So the person you were at 2, whether you were like hard-headed and stubborn and, wanted to do everything yourself, a trait theorist would say that there's a very good likelihood that you will have those same personality traits as you're older, because a lot of these traits remain consistent over time, unless something happens and comes in that sort of, negatively reinforces it or changes it. But for the most part, we have our personality type that is set from a very early age, and we all have a unique combination of these traits. So someone may be born with a proclivity to be much more anxious than another person. And so understanding that sort of pre-programming to be anxious is something that person may actually carry with them through their whole lives, and it be a part of their personality throughout their lifespan. The last two, so we have evolutionary psychology. So we've all probably heard like survival of the fittest and Charles Darwin, especially when it comes to physical traits. But there's a way to take this perspective and apply it to psychological traits as well. So evolutionary theorists look at behavior and take a look at like, how has this behavior helped us survive over time? Is there a way that it is part of our evolutionary process to fear a certain thing, because fear is a way that we keep ourselves safe? Or another example that I like is that human beings, current day human beings, Homo sapiens, have a brain that is hardwired to be able to look at anybody in the face and within moments be able to determine whether that person feels friendly, whether they feel hostile, whether you think they're going to harm you. But we have this ability to assess in a beat whether we think that someone is a threat or not. And that is definitely an evolutionary advantage because the people who couldn't do that were wiped out or put themselves in dangerous situations and weren't able to then pass along their genes to future generations. And then the last one is the biopsychosocial model. And this one really, if you think about the social determinants of health that we just talked about, that's kind of what this is getting at, which is that you can't take anyone out of context. And all of this is sort of interacting together. And so what's happening to me biologically and psychologically and socially, that all of these things sort of work to interact with each other and create certain conditions and certain behaviors. And so they really encourage us to look at the context of where somebody's at and what they're dealing with, rather than just sort of looking at them in isolation and thinking we can make any valid assumptions about what we see in terms of behavior. So here's just a couple of examples. I want to give you a sense of how different lenses impact how we see different behaviors. And so let's start with the first scenario. We have a child who has demonstrated that they are having trouble with reading comprehension. So they may read something, and when they're asked to test on it later or remember or recall what they learned, that they're having a hard time doing it. And so people from the biological perspective are going to look at biology. So is there something happening in the brain? Is there a structure that is damaged or underdeveloped? Are there genetic factors that I need to know about? Or something much more practical, is it just that they have poor eyesight and they need glasses, and that's sort of impacting how they're dealing with it? Cognitive folks would really want to take a look at like what's happening, you know, in terms of how they process information. Is there some disturbance in that? Is there a learning disability, or is there some other factor that might be causing this difficulty that isn't, you know, genetics or something else? And then finally, the behavioral approach could be taking a look at, you know, what's happening in the rest of their lives. So maybe in school, they're encouraged to sit down and read, but maybe when they go home, there's a real lack of support and reinforcement for that. And so the child is sort of getting these mixed messages about this is important, this is not important. And they're sort of learning from caregivers that this is not something that we value or prioritize. The other thing that behaviorists would look at is, was the teaching good? Like, is there some gap in terms of what the teacher thought they communicated and what the student received? So is there just a gap in knowledge that we could take a look at? The second scenario, we have an employee who procrastinates at work. So someone from a psychodynamic perspective would really want to look at, you know, is there some unconscious reason, or do you have some sort of hidden fear of being successful? Is that why you're turning things in late or not giving yourself a chance to do things well? So do you have some sort of unconscious need to not succeed in this case? A behavioralist would look again for what behaviors are being rewarded. So maybe, you know, a lot of people in this situation procrastinate, or maybe the boss is unintentionally reinforcing this procrastination behavior. Socioculturally, we would just look at what's happening in the rest of the office. Is this kind of a norm? Does everyone kind of treat their work this way? Or do you have some folks who are better with time management and getting their work done, and that this person is kind of an anomaly to that? So are they just sort of going with the flow, or is it something about them specifically? Um, Biologically, does the person have undiagnosed ADHD? As someone who is undiagnosed or was diagnosed with ADHD later in life, I can recall lots of times at work where I felt like, you know, if I got assigned something 2 weeks ago, like I could not start it until the night before, because you know, there's a thing about the ADHD mind where if something is not interesting and novel and sort of personally challenging, that it's hard for them to be interested in it. And so they need the urgency of a deadline to sort of kick them into gear and get the work done. So is there something like that happening? And then finally, the humanistic people would be asking questions like, do you like your work? Is this something you want to do? Do you feel valued? Do you feel appreciated? Or is it that you feel like you used to work hard, but you know, that didn't get you anywhere. People kept lumping a lot of work on you, or you weren't getting the recognition that you deserve. And so a humanist would be like, what's sort of happening feelings wise that may be making you have a harder time engaging with your work. So hopefully this gives you a good sense about how different theorists can look at the same problem and come to different conclusions about what possible causes could be. Finally, I just want to go through some different careers in psychology, to let you know sort of how people apply this stuff. And so, clinical psychologists, of which I am one, these are the folks who get trained to do therapy or other mental health treatment. Typically, you can work in a lot of different settings, hospitals. I worked in schools a lot during my graduate training, private practice, mental health clinics, research institutions. And typically, to become a clinical psychologist, you need a master's degree or a PhD. And then after you get your degree, there's a lot of internship hours that you need to collect. Like, for instance, I had to have 3,000 hours of clinical experience before I was even able to sit for my licensure exam. And that's a big time commitment. Social workers can also do sort of therapy, but they're not included in this because social work and psychology are considered different fields. I will say that social work in general does a way better job at sort of looking at those social determinants of health than psychology has historically. Then there's counseling psychology. So similar vein to clinical psych, but these folks are not necessarily treating mental disorders, but they're much more offering support for life transitions and helping with personal growth. So, if you've got a relationship issue, or you're making a career change, or you just lost someone and you need help processing that, a counseling psychologist would be the person to go to. And their settings, private practice, sometimes in community settings. A lot of times you'll find these folks on college campuses. So if you look at the Career and Student Success Center at Washtenaw, a lot of those folks are going to be in this counseling psychology bucket. And then there's also employee assistance programs where you can go and talk about sort of specific issues you're having. Folks in this degree or in this track need a master's degree typically, and there are some internships, and some states require licensure. So you have to sort of determine where you're at and if you're living in a state that wants you to sort of get certified or licensed in some way. Forensic psychologists, these are the ones who evaluate criminals, assess mental competency for trial. They may be called to offer expert testimony. They may profile suspects. They may be a part of sort of creating a rehabilitation plan for somebody who has been convicted. So these folks work in courtrooms, jails, and prisons. They may work for law enforcement. They may work in private practice, but their main job, again, is to sort of really help evaluate and assess competency and criminality for certain behaviors. This field, you typically at least needs a bachelor's degree, but there's not sort of specific licensure for being a forensic psychologist. So in certain states and areas, you may need to take an additional certification course to learn how to do some of these things, because they're not often taught in a graduate program, but definitely not needing the PhD like some of the others. Neuropsychologists, they work with the brain injuries and neurological diseases, cognitive disorders. So these are the people who are going to be working with people with Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or other sort of neurological diseases. So their work is much more medical typically. So they're in hospitals and clinics and rehab centers and sometimes research institutions. And typically you need a PhD for this track. My home phone is ringing. I apologize for that. Then there are the industrial organizational psychologists. They mainly work in workplace settings. So they're looking to improve workplace morale, behavior, motivation, job satisfaction. They take a look at whether leadership techniques are effective and well, or whether you have a problem with leadership. And then there's organizational development, helping people sort of develop skills and habits and things like that. Hold on, I'm going to try to pause this for a second. Okay, it's not coming through. So anyway, you're hearing a home message coming through. Okay, so I'm just going to continue with that playing in the background. I apologize. So educational psychologists. So these folks work in schools. They want to make sure that kids can thrive in the schools. They want to make sure that the teaching methods are sort of in alignment with, what the learner needs. They want to assess learning outcomes. They typically work in school settings, so K through 12 and college. They may work as private consultants. They may work in government educational agencies, although with the new Trump administration, we may be seeing the eradication of that. So that's something to think about. And then in terms of education or training, a master's or PhD. For folks who practice in schools, they typically want some type of state licensure, but there's a lot of flexibility there. Psychiatry, these are the folks who get to diagnose and prescribe medication and treat mental disorders. They are medical doctors. So they go through med school just like a surgeon or an OBGYN or any other medical professional. But then after their medical school, they go through 4 more residency years in psychiatry. So they put in a lot of time and effort, and they are doctors. So they work in hospitals, clinics, private practice, research institutions. And just a side note, they make a boatload of money. So if you're sort of liking psychology and wondering what your options are, most psychiatrists in the Ann Arbor area in private practice charge at least $300 an hour. So obviously, money is not the main factor for job satisfaction always, but something to consider. And then you have behavioral health technicians. So if you're listening to all of this thinking, I don't know if I want a graduate degree, but I know I want to help and support people, there are positions called behavioral health techs where you can actually work in different environments like hospitals, inpatient treatment centers, rehab centers, group homes, and provide support and care for people who have mental illness, brain injury, developmental disabilities, things like that, and offer support that way. So you can use these skills but not necessarily have to put in all the time for grad school. So bachelors are usually sufficient. You may need to get different certifications depending on the population you're working with to make sure that you kind of understand the specific unique needs of that group. And you may need to get a little bit extra training, but you're not needing to sort of put yourself through the graduate grind. So that's it for this. Thanks for humoring me and listening. So just remember, there will be 2 quizzes that are open today, Friday. So one is on the syllabus, one is on the material I just covered. So it's open now. And I'm gonna I'm not going to post any readings for this week because you're listening to this and you have other stuff to do. And just remember, if you need to access the slides for the quiz, you can access those all on Blackboard. But I thank you. Thank you for listening.